So, challenge. We decided to probably not go into too much detail, but do a sort of back and forth as much as possible. And I'll start with a challenge that you mentioned to me, which really sticks out in your mind, and I remember it very well because it went on for, it was a very long challenge. It started in 1996 when you were invited to do a commission with Rachel Whiteread for the Holocaust Memorial, and the challenge ended. Perhaps it's never ended, but it went on until at least the year 2000. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. That challenge, and I didn't do the commission. It was a competition in Vienna, a big international competition, which Rachel won. And she called me as soon as she won it and asked me to work with her on it. And I was at a time where I had just left the Serpentine after 7 years because of the decision to go freelance as my second child was born, and I thought it would be nice to see my child occasionally. We thought it would be a very straightforward thing, 9 months, production, installation, done and dusted, and obviously it took 5 years, and for all kinds of reasons that are all to do with politics and not with the artwork itself or producing an artwork. And I had only worked within the confines of 4 walls before and had never been outside. And Daniel Buren once said, the moment you take a work from a gallery into the street, you are dealing with politics. And we learned that the hard way, because the work was produced within a few months, then went into storage, and a storm of disapproval broke out from all kinds of areas. The local residents at first, the right-wing Freedom Party, the various other local politicians, the archaeological lobby that wanted the excavations that were in the square where the memorial was to stand as the main memorial, and also parts, even though the memorial had been instigated by Simon Wiesenthal, he had enemies within the Jewish community who were operating very vociferously against the memorial. So suddenly part of my job was also negotiating with all of these different factions, and it took a really long time. We thought at one point it would never be built. It was also very much part of my role to keep the artist on board, who unsurprisingly wanted out after a while. But I'm happy to report, if you don't know, that it was inaugurated eventually. A Solomonic decision was made, too complicated to go into now, but the memorial is there. Rachel is really proud of it. She's currently having a show in Vienna, the first time she's been back in 18 years, so it's a wonderful cycle. But let me ask you, I mean, in case you don't know Peer, it's an amazing, small but very powerful and very important gallery that Ingrid has led in an amazing and visionary way for 20 years. And you have had many challenges, especially around, 10, 11 years ago, where your main funder, Sainsbury's, suddenly changed their position. So how did you deal with that? To be
very fair to the Sainsbury Family Charitable, it wasn't sudden. They said they thought the project, which I'd been hired, I'm often mistaken for having set Peer up, but I was actually interviewed, but it was in a sort of different configuration. It didn't have a gallery space at the time, so I've sort of reinvented it over the 20 years, so that's why it's very much identified as my project, but it originally wasn't. But so I think it was felt that it was a sort of a temporary project, but by the time after, I think it was about 8 years of having run it, it was felt that the trustees felt that there was a lot of other things going on in London, and let's call it a day. So there was 2.5 years of funding left, which was reduced over that time. And the challenge for me was to say, well, if that money goes, can I find somebody else to help support it, or maybe become a client of the Arts Council? And it was sort of fight or flight moment, and I like a challenge, of course, so I decided to fight. And like you, or like Rachel, I sort of along as time went on, I wondered whether this was the right thing to do, because you have to make a lot of sacrifices often when you want to. It was like starting the organisation from scratch, but we did have a gallery space and an incredibly cheap rent, thanks to Hackney Council, and it seemed like it wasn't broken. So why get rid of it? So I fought to, and I did gradually over time get supporters. We did become an Arts Council National Portfolio client in 2012. So it was a 4-year period where we were skating on incredibly thin ice. But at the same time, we were doing very challenging projects like installing 80-ton boulders in parks and putting Mike Nelson in Venice and things, not for the Biennale 3 years ago, but 13 years ago. So challenge is sort of my middle name, and I rise to it often to my own detriment, I feel. But let's go back to you, your challenge. After, when you're very much identified with having set up this incredible triennial at Folkestone, which, and I know, again, having seen you many times over those years, what an amazing challenge that was. Do you want to talk about setting up?
Yeah, well, again, that was something that I could talk about for much longer than now is allowed, but it was very different for somebody who'd only worked in London, apart from my brief stint at the Arnolfini, but and in a way, it's a curator's dream to be given a whole town to work with. And I had very much Münster Skulpturprojekte in mind when I developed the proposal, the whole concept for it. But the main difference, I lived in Münster for a while as a child, and Münster is very different from Folkestone, which I didn't know. I didn't know Folkestone until I was invited to come up with an idea. But Münster is quite affluent and has a museum and a Kunstverein, and Folkestone is probably one of the most deprived seaside towns in the country, and had no cultural infrastructure whatsoever. So as a curator, you work with tabula rasa, and a bit like with the Vienna project, you are again taken out of your comfort zone and things you've experienced before, because in order to realize a project like that, you have to have a very clear vision, and you have to inspire others. You have to inspire the local council.
And that's a tough one, I know.
Yeah, I tell you, it was so
inspiring local authorities. It's very difficult.
Especially in Kent. And you have to go to schools, to the taxi firms, to the restaurants and hotels.
I think community consultation is
I had never done anything
the C
like
word,
that before.
shall we say? But
Yeah.
it can be very, very, very challenging.
Yeah.
But actually, it can
Hugely
be
rewarding.
amazingly rewarding as well.
Yeah, I mean, I took 3 years to set off the first triennial in 2008, and we had, at the end of the 3 months, we had 22 commissions, of which 9 stayed in the town permanently. So we also, part of the concept was to build a collection without walls, rather than go for a capital project. And we had 300 press reactions, nationally and internationally. Obviously, we couldn't count the visitors, but and the next one that I did in 2011, the difference of going back to the same people in the town.
No,
and
they
saying,
really wanted it.
They wanted it. They loved what had happened to their town. And so the first time it was a real uphill struggle, but you have a similar
I'm going to give you a quick, if you can do a quick answer now, that would be, I'm sorry, with challenging, it's tricky. But
Yes, I very, very briefly, I had a sort of, more recently, a similar experience about getting your local residents and the locals on board, and then they're sort of gagging for it. They really want it, which is terrific. When I just in 2016 did a capital project, so although we'd been in Hoxton Street since 2012, we got the shop next door, so we increased our footprint by 100%. And then we started talking to the local tenant management organisation and got some Arts Council support, which we then matched and did what's in the greater scheme of things a small project, but for us it was incredibly transformative. We
fantastic garden.
We built a garden, we put seating and planted trees, and got a clock which Chris O'Feely did the commission for, and we've got a sculpture on the garden wall which is to be inhabited by birds, and the locals absolutely love it, and they've really taken ownership of that. And so I think and that was the biggest challenge to date.